I'm formally beginning our symposium on the long 18th century in our Race and Law and Justice Symposium. So what I thought I would do is go last, first of all. So what I shall do is introduce our first speaker, and then just to remind everyone, this is our fourth symposium. It's the Symposium for Slavery, Race and Law during the long 18th century. Christy Pichichero is delivering a paper called Race and the Docile Body, Politics of Blackness, Social Justice and Law in the 18th Century French Military. And Christy Pichichero is an associate professor of French and history and director of faculty diversity at George Mason University. She's also the current president of the Western Society for French History. Her first book, The Military Enlightenment, War and Culture from Louis XIV to Napoleon, of 2017, so fairly recent, was a finalist for the Kensher Book Prize for the best interdisciplinary work in 18th century studies. She is currently writing two books. The first examines processes of racialization in 18th century Europe. The second is about war and humanism. As an activist scholar, Christy organizes pedagogical workshops and roundtables on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism at institutions throughout the United States. Warm welcome to Christy.
Thank you so much, Miranda. And I have to say, those books, I feel like I'm just trying to stay alive right now and not lose my mind. I have a child home from school today because she has allergies and they thought she had COVID. So we are just having a very interesting day in my house.
You can pretend that it's not happening.
Okay, I will pretend that there's not a child leaving this room right now. Cléa, je suis carrément en train de faire une conférence. Allez. Oui, c'est Miranda. Oui, so my paper still hasn't loaded, but that will not detract me from beginning, because what I want to do first is to say a great big thanks to you, Miranda, to Steve, and to the American University for Paris, all of our wonderful colleagues there, for this important and timely set of discussions. It's quite a heavy lift organizationally, so I'm truly appreciative of these efforts, and have also felt so inspired and really am honored to have been included in this symposium, and to have this chance to reconnect with so many brilliant colleagues, as well as students that I met at AUP a little more than 2 years ago now. So let's see. I've been enjoying and contemplating the stimulating papers and discussions that we've had so far, spanning time and the globe. And I've been delighted to see the synergies in our work and to begin to grow from the interventions of these wonderful colleagues. In my remarks today, I think the title probably promised a bit more than I'm going to do. So what I promise now is that I'll do my best to talk about some of these things. And so what I've done is that I've decided to follow advice that I have often given, but not often followed myself. As a Black woman working on decolonial histories of gender, sexuality, and race in the early modern French Empire, many times I find myself making assumptions about my audience as I talk or write, and I end up throwing out the expression, "it goes without saying." And I like to warn others that when they find themselves stating "it goes without saying," that it's likely that whatever they are not going to say is probably exactly what needs to be treated with intentionality. So today I'm going to spend really the first half of my intervention discussing method and theory in order to foreground the fact that our ways of knowing can unwittingly replicate historical power relationships and continually obfuscate lives, places, and events that historical actors, historians, and theorists have participated in erasing. So I'll start there, and then in the second part of my remarks, I will offer an initial interrogation of this question of race and Blackness, brownness in particular, docile bodies in the 18th century French military. And I'll be really rethinking the Foucauldian concepts of discipline, biopower, and docile bodies, and trying to push us forth into something new that is more restorative to these Black soldiers. So here goes nothing. So I, like my fellow colleagues in this symposium, have been interested for many years in the body as a site of political formation and existential contestation, practices and institutions controlling the body, from forced migration, policing and prisons, plantation labor, hospitals, military drill, practices and institutions to harness the body's power, slavery and forms of forced labor, including reproduction in the slave economy, and current practices of prison labor, the military, controlling bodies through discourse, the law, and violence, whether threatened or actualized, as a praxis, lies at the very center of political ontology, which is why political thinkers and philosophers have been discussing the processes and dimensions of this praxis since Aristotle. Problems and the disproportionate, indeed lethal dangers of myriad corporeal encounters with the law constitute part of the heritage of embodied knowledge for African Americans and many other minoritized groups around the world. Public awareness and discussion of, as well as resistance to this reality, has increased exponentially after the murders of numerous individuals in the past few years, including Adama Traoré, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Daniel Prude, murdered in a spit bag in my own hometown of Rochester, New York, nearly a year ago to the day. These crimes have brought a welcome urgency to scholarly and community questioning about differential meanings, interpretations, threats of and to bodies subjectively seen, sometimes labeled as singularly or intersectionally non-normative, undisciplined, wayward, women's bodies, Black, brown, Asian, Jewish, Muslim, Roma bodies, queer, trans, non-binary bodies, immigrant and refugee bodies, disabled or differently abled bodies. As we approach these topics, methodological considerations are capital. And here I want to highlight very quickly 4 insights or stances. First and most broadly, I want to encourage students and colleagues to bring all of yourselves, all of your humanity to your work, your rigorous, critical, analytical mind, but also your creativity and experimental spirit, your intuition and embodied knowledge, and your heart. This approach to scholarship is in no way unscientific. It is decolonial and a more epistemologically comprehensive means toward interrogating the past and present and perhaps illuminating ways to a better future. Second, one of the most critical moves that I and other scholars are making is to center the bodies and experiences of the individuals and groups that power and the law were or are targeting. We've seen that in this symposium in many interesting ways. Those who were at the Digital Humanities Conference yesterday saw some very interesting projects that are doing the same for the colonial era and looking at enslaved populations. In my work, this means centering the Black body and Black experience. Geographic and perspectival shifts are a key part of the process of discovery and to anchoring a decolonial flipped history. Historian Jessica Marie Johnson and others have shifted the frame in asking, what does this history look like if told from the perspective of Africa, not as a stop on the way from Europe to the colonies, but as an origin, a matrix of societies, of gazes and individuals. In this case, the geographic recentering automatically leads to a perspectival and ultimately a paradigmatic shift, which can reveal a veritable cornucopia of data, including richly diverse evidence pertaining to violence, the body, and the law, which are awaiting their researchers. So often we find, as art historian Cécile Froment recently said of her work on early modern Africa and Brazil, that sources and the lines of inquiry have been hiding in plain sight. The third point in the vein of flipped history, I'm interested not only in how institutions framed the lives of enslaved, multifariously imperialized and intersectionally vulnerable individuals, but how these individuals navigated legal and cultural structures. Bringing the wisdom of embodied knowledge, we can work to reconstruct the daily lives, professions, loves, hates, opportunities and constraints of African and African descended individuals across time and space. In this work, trade comptoirs, Parisian salons, and the full range of other spaces of subjugation, including my own area of specialty of the early modern military, are also spaces in which complex battles for defining the parameters of power in state, collective, and personal forms unfolded. An important part of this story is to see the ways that Africans and African descended people used or attempted to use Europeans and imperial structures to their advantage, ingeniously, desperately, or nonchalantly, with varying degrees of success. My fourth and final point on method has to do with theory. Those of you who know me are already aware that I believe it is critical to any decolonial praxis to make our theoretical theoretical frameworks just as seriously as we do our archives and other methods. Many of the theoretical concepts and paradigms in which we situate our research are imbued with colonial logics, even as they aim to unveil the workings of power. Not only do we need to be aware of the seductions of theoretical expediency and therefore highly selective in what concepts we engage and how we engage them, we must also retool theoretical frameworks and invent new ones altogether in order to further decolonial scholarship. This is what drove me to try to rethink the nexus of Foucauldian concepts of the docile body, discipline, and biopower in the context of my query regarding the history of Black soldiers, or ones who were referred to as Black, in the 17th and 18th century French army. So now I'd like to start to weave these strands together. In the heterogeneous longue durée history of bodies of law and the body, the early modern era is of particular importance as an epoch in which the modalities of political power over the body either modulated or came into being in the nexus of global trade, knowledge exchange, warfare, colonization, and chattel slavery. The 18th century is the period during which Michel Foucault locates this sea change, which he illustrates in Discipline and Punish through a case study of the soldier's body. Foucault claimed that while the military body of the 17th century was idealized as one of courage and honor, in the latter half of the 18th century, the soldier became, and I quote, something that can be made out of a formless clay, an inapt body, end quote. He wrote, and I quote again, and I do this just so that we're all on the same page. The fundamental reference was not to the state of nature, but to the meticulously subordinated cogs of a machine, not to the primal social contract, but to permanent coercions, not to fundamental rights, but to indefinitely progressive forms of training, not to the general will, but to automatic docility, end quote. While conceding that in every society, the body is subject to power, he contends that the 18th century was a watershed moment in defining and controlling this docile body through multiple disciplines that targeted even the most minute movements of the body. In the history of sexuality and several other works based on his Collège de France lectures, Foucault expanded this framework into the notion of biopower, which he defined as, and here I'll quote again from the history of sexuality, an explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. And he later remarked in Security, Territory, and Population, again from these lectures, where discipline is the technology deployed to make individuals behave to be efficient and productive workers, biopolitics is deployed to manage population. So here's where I'm going to begin my critique. I said a minute ago that the story of state and economic formation through disciplining the human body coalesced in the nexus of global trade, knowledge exchange, warfare, colonization, and chattel slavery. Rather shockingly, and as many of you likely know, Foucault sidelines issues of slavery, and thereby those of race and racism that attend slavery in his account of Docile Bodies, Discipline, and Body Power. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault argues that discipline and the construction of docile bodies is not applicable to the bodies of slaves. Foucault wrote, and I quote, "But in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the disciplines became general formulas of domination. They were different from slavery because they were not based on a relation of appropriation of bodies. Indeed, the elegance of discipline lay in the fact that it could dispense with this costly and violent relation by obtaining effects of utility at least as great." Foucault reiterates this point in his essay Subject and Power, the subject and power, saying that power is exercised only over free subjects and only insofar as they are free. Slavery is not a power relationship when a man is in chains, only when he has some possible mobility, even a chance of escape, end quote. So, needless to say, though, this is all the stuff that needs to be said. It is disappointing, if not bewildering and ridiculous, that Foucault would advance these propositions based on overly simplistic, absolute categories of appropriated bodies and bodies in bondage. It is unacceptable that Foucault deliberately excluded slavery and the plantation complex in his definitions of power, discipline, and docile bodies. This speaks to comments that Jennifer, Lionel, and others brought up 2 weeks ago in their excellent papers, this long tradition of French denial and or refusal to engage with its past as an enslaving imperial and colonial power in formulations of national and human history, not to mention its present. In these narratives and theoretical frameworks, race and racism, as well as racisme d'État, are rendered not just invisible, but in some way unthinkable. Foucault might have done well to think more deeply about slavery and marronage, as well as the realities of the plantation power system, putting two and two together and imagining the applicability of his own idea of where there is power, there is resistance. And as a side note, and I'm not going to talk about this at all today, Agamben did not do any better in this regard in his own thinking about biopower and spaces of exception, but this is for another discussion. So in my work, I'm challenging Foucault, and I'm sorry, my email keeps going off. I'll turn that off. Just a second. That may or may not turn off. If it doesn't, that's okay. Okay. So pardon the interruption. Now my computer, of course, is going mad. Okay, so I am challenging Foucault's conceptualization of political technologies of power and rethinking them in order to, number one, add to the work of Achille Mbembe, Alessandro Corio, Jack Taylor, and others in accounting for slavery and policing Black bodies in the system of discipline and biopower, recognizing not just their applicability, but the central role of slavery and plantation power in the formation of modern biopower. Second, to identify and compare the structures of biopower and discipline in the plantation system and in the military. And third, to trace the contours of a self-redemptive resistance to biopower. So this is my own theorization. From the perspective of our query into regimes of power and law, it stands to reason that in our quest to center Black lives in the 18th century, we should analyze intersecting systems of power and docility and that Black individuals experienced and navigated, in this case, the plantation and the military. Indeed, what Miranda is calling in her paper, the Transoceanic French slave polity and the French armed forces overlapped in many ways that I, along with other scholars, have been studying. So in the minutes that remain, I'll give you a quick glimpse at what I'm doing with this right now. So I just want to give you a moment of background on the military side, which is maybe less familiar to people, especially with regard to Black soldiers. So Black and brown men served in the French armed forces throughout the French Empire in different capacities across multiple branches of the military. In the Antilles, as Frédéric Réjean and others have shown, military service was a pathway toward emancipation for the enslaved. Looking at the broader historiography, scholars have tended to focus on the men of color who served during the Haitian and French revolutions. Think the Légion des Américains, Dumas, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Toussaint Louverture, and others. Now, I'm interested in these people and I'm working on them as well. However, along with Régent, André Corvisier before him, Stuart King, and John Garrigus, I'm also focusing on military men, military service of men of color prior to 1789, because I think the century that preceded the outbreak of the French and Haitian revolutions is foundational to the process of racialization in relation to science, culture, and the state. For this reason, I'm tracing Black bodies back in time from the age of Toussaint to that of the 17th century wars of Louis XIV. And I want to spotlight very quickly 2 examples of what I'm working on here. So far that we know, the first Black military men serving in the regular French army were enlisted as timbaliers, or war drummers who kept the time during marches and beat out tactical commands during battle. Seemingly men of color began serving in this capacity before 1650. Now, you may be rolling your eyes and saying, oh great, here we go with the classic stereotypes, Black dudes being enlisted in the rhythm section of the French army. Understood. My mind goes there as well. But from a military perspective, the tambalier was one of the most respected and important roles, both practically and symbolically, to a regiment while marching or in combat. The tambalier's presence was felt and heard far and wide, and taking him down or capturing him was again of both tactical and symbolic significance. If you imagine the incredible chaos of battle at the time, the thundering horses, booming cannon, gunshots from multiple firearms, muskets, rifles, pistols, clashing of swords, and of course, human screams, all in thick smoke. Without a tambalier beating out directions for what to do on the battlefield, an entire army can fall apart and lead to much further slaughter. What is more, like capturing a standard bearer, capturing a tambalier was a glorious feather in the cap of the enemy. The drum itself was a piece of art and was often further decorated with ornate gold embroidered drapery containing the royal insignia. These men quite literally represented the patrie in battle. An anonymous source wrote that the tambalier had to be courageous and guard the honor of the king's army, since it is sad and shameful to give the enemy a trophy. Capturing the tambalier was such a point of pride and honor that it was memorialized in paintings. And had I been more organized, I would have shown you some images right now. So just have to wait for this to come out in print and I'll show you these paintings of tambalier, French tambalier being captured by the enemy. So this also is further evidence of their visibility and respect in the eyes of the military and the state. That is, that we see these in these paintings, all of these Black and brown tambaliers that were tracked and were granted spots, in fact, at the Invalides in their retirement. So this is what I'm seeing so far in my research, is that they were memorialized and treated in their retirement at the Invalides. Men of color were sprinkled throughout the king's armies prior to 1789 and only came together in a single unit before the Légion des Américains during the 1740s and Marshal Maurice de Saxe's Black Company and his Légion de Volontaires. They these guys were levied during the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. The unit was largely composed of, as a whole, the regiment was largely composed of Eastern Europeans, Poles, and Tartars, except for its first company, which was predominantly composed of Black, in quotation marks, Uhlans, which were light cavalry from France's Caribbean colonies, as well as Africa, Asia, and South America. Saxe took great and deliberate pains to assemble his company once the king authorized the creation of the Volontaires this month, many years ago, on March 15th in 1743. He recruited them from other units in the French army, many of which had that single Black tambalier who played those drums to control movements of troops. He had members of his entourage inquire about the whereabouts of these Black soldiers, corresponded with their commanding officers, and offered handsome payoffs in order to acquire each soldier. He also took initiatives to get freemen or slaves who were from the colonies, but who were either living or temporarily located in France. In one instance, he was able to enlist 2 Black enslaved men located in the Atlantic hub of Bordeaux, since they had not been registered properly, which nullified the ownership status of their masters. Saxe's volontaire and his recruitment methods attracted the attention and the ire of colonial lobbyists who were already present, active, and powerful in the 1740s. These individuals were horrified that Saxe would willfully steal their unquote unquote property, and they were even more so at the thought that their former slaves would receive military training, that they might one day decide to turn against their former masters. They put tremendous pressure on the naval minister, the Comte de Maurepas, to intercede on their behalf and to curtail Saxe's mustering efforts, which Maurepas did. So now, returning to our contemplation of race, power, law, and the body, a number of questions come to the fore. Where did the idea of having a Black Timbalier come from? What political, cultural, and racial valences attended these Black men in the dispensation of their crucial responsibilities in army operations? Looking forward toward Maréchal Maurice de Saxe's unit, what happens when different regimes of power, discipline, and law, the Code Noir, the metropolitan statutes policing people of color, and the military intersected and clashed? How, why, and when did the first generations of Timbaliers end up in France and then enlisting in the French army? How did these men live in their units and in relation to their comrades and commanding officers? For Antoine François Camp, a 26-year-old Moor from Spain, Louis Canterbecque, 17 years of age and hailing from Pondichéry in India, 19-year-old Marc Udet of Martinique, and the nearly 80 comrades in Saxe's company, what did their Blackness mean to them? How did they experience, navigate, fall prey to, and take advantage of competing systems of discipline and power in which their bodies were simultaneously inscribed? So schematically, in these last couple of minutes, I will share with you some of the key features of plantation biopower and then connect them to the military regime of biopower with the goal of charting out a theory that I'm exploring right now as a biopolitics of self-possession or self-empowerment or resistance. So regarding slavery and the plantation complex, I want to draw attention to a couple of key conceptual signposts. As a biopolitical mechanism to control human life and population, plantation power and its commodity fetishism were actualized in a myriad of modalities of discipline geared to strip down enslaved people into a subsocial, subhuman state, one that can be likened to Agamben's notion of bare life, a life rendered invisible and excluded from the realm and statutes of the polis. From the standpoint of the law, codes regarding slavery in the French Empire and other early modern slaving states were unevenly applied and unevenly complied with, and in all cases did little on the ground to protect the enslaved individuals' lives and limbs. From the standpoint of necropolitics, and this is Mbembe's term, and plantation power, the threat and spectacle of manifold forms of violence and death functioned to discipline slaves into the liminal zombie habitus of beings existing somewhere on the spectrum between life and death. In addition to the threat of violence and death, scholars have analyzed a number of other tactics of discipline in plantation power. Stephanie Brown and Jack Taylor have proffered fantastic analyses of panoptic power in the architecture of slaver transport ships and the layout of plantations in order to foster the internalizing of discipline on the part of the enslaved population. Scholars have also analyzed the dehumanizing husbandry approach to reproductive labor of enslaved women on plantations and the status of their offspring as slaves, as yet another specifically gendered structure of plantation biopower. I don't have time to go into all of this here, but I do want to underscore just one other piece, which is processes that Orlando Patterson refers to as natal alienation or genealogical isolation, the severing of familial ties in order to further plunge the enslaved into isolation and living death. These touch points become extremely useful as we think about Black men serving in the early modern French military. And it is here that the biopolitics of self-possession, self-empowerment, and resistance come into view. For the enslaved and those for whom a return, for the enslaved and those for whom a return to or a first experience of slavery was always looming, and we really get that sense in Miranda's paper as well. Enlisting in the military meant a process of coming into the polis and into the law. In 18th century France, there were, of course, evolving and ever stricter policies to discipline Black and brown bodies, as we know from the work of Sue Peabody and others. The army provided, in many cases, a reprieve from these realities and also offered a plethora of equalizing conditions that I have been studying. As soldiers, Black and brown men entered into the state's care, uniforms, horses, weapons, sleeping conditions, food, pay. They also benefited, as did other soldiers, from shifts in cultures of martial punishment. And here we can think of Arnaud Guignet's work on tracing the evolution away from debilitating physical punishments in the military and death toward the pen or the pain, the punishment of public opinion. So this is an important sort of point of orientation. For Black officers during the French Revolution, this also meant their being able to leverage their military service in order to ask for favors of the state on behalf of their children and families. And I've also been tracking these requests, which are very uncommon compared to white officers of the time. And of course, as Frédéric Réjean has mentioned about the enslaved serving in the Antilles, enlisting meant the opportunity to acquire military skills that were used in self-defense and in defense of their freedom. Returning to the notion of the genealogical isolate, the military offered Black and brown men a pathway into community and into genealogy. My analyses show that, like their white comrades, these men had nicknames, ones without racial markings. And so I've been tracking this carefully through time, and that individuals were able to establish their genealogies, whether real or invented, within the new space and new audience of the military. And I think of one example, Jean Hiton, who is recorded to have told his officers and comrades that he was descended from African royalty. Entry into the state's care and into community combine in the notion of self-inscription into the nation, gaining access to be able to claim a degree of connection to Frenchness, and therefore that was theretofore impossible for them. Access to the realms of patriotism. Here we can think again about the Légion des Américains that formed during the French Revolution, and to heroism, which we see in these paintings of the Tambalier. I do not want to paint too rosy a picture here. Serving in the early modern French military was no walk in the park, and the necropolitical system of martial justice was also arbitrary in written law, uneven in application, and utterly cruel in many instances. And while some men in Marshal Sax's regiment were able to marry and build families in the metropole, others, even famed officers like the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, never married and had no progeny, at least none that lived and had their stories told. So racializing and racist biopolitical regimes and cultures plotted against their genealogical lines, locking them painfully in the present during an age of enlightenment that was obsessively thinking about posterity. This makes it all the more important to tell their stories. And that's where I'll end. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Christy. So the thing that happened before it was me who was coming next, which is completely confusing format-wise, was when I asked a question and then the next speaker did it. So I'm a little baffled about how to proceed right now. So I think the answer is to open it up a little bit and see if anyone wants to ask a question right now before I do it. So I just want to open up the first, and
Sorry,
then,
that was long, people. That was long. You are very brave. If you're in
but
France, drink the wine. If you're at
I'm
home,
drinking
if you're in
wine
the States,
already.
drink the
It's
coffee.
fine. Yeah. So I just want to invite, I have tons of questions, but I don't want to kind of hog the mic. So I just sort of would be delighted to have someone in the audience do it. But if that isn't going to happen, I can ask a question. I have a couple of things. One is, a sort of pushback comment.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, please.
Okay, so I have a bunch of pushback comments.
Yeah,
lots of really
good.
rich stuff in your talk, and I've been really interested in that regiment, so I'm so glad you're working on it. And I have been bumping against a lot of the soldiers. Interesting cases of people, are they soldiers? It's not always clear exactly what it means to be a soldier. Like, does taking a ship with a bunch of soldiers make you a soldier? In other words, it's just there's a lot of ambiguity about these things. So especially since when these guys after the 7 Years' War, a train wreck empire-wise, show up in the metropole and say, I'm free, I fought for Martinique, it was a rule there, you got to be free if you fought, and so it's generally made up. And that's fine because, it's sort of a contest because basically nothing that anyone of color says ever prevails over any white person's lie. So it's sort of a contest between fantasies. They always lose, no matter whether it's true or not. But I guess my real question, so I have a lot of things that I love about what you're working on, but my real big pushback has to do with the difference between disciplinary power and slavery. And of course, we know about the Cuban 19th century plantation machine. So it isn't at all true that these are completely distinct. I don't want to say that, but you do see some things that are different. And I just want to signal what I think they are in the French context. For example, you do see a shift in the 18th century away from, and I think this is probably empire-wide for all other places, away from the mutilation of the body, which is indicated in the Code Noir, with an idea of keeping the body intact as a laboring body. So that's one thing that does feel like that's important, right? Because as someone, I wrote an article and have studied civis, and if you've worked on that topic for non-French people, barbarism, the abuse, and it's not even torture because it has no judicial function, just really shocking forms of violence, like crucifying people, really unbelievable things, for like killing a pig. Right. I mean, things happen that you just can't believe. And as someone who works on French Guiana, where the frontier is a war against marronage, the kinds of violence that you see do not feel the same as the Cuban plantation machine or some of these plantation places where it's really settled. So they have a different kind of spatial control. And so I just feel like there probably has to be some way in which you nuance your story to take measure of some of these subtleties. That's my main thing.
Yeah, I like that, Miranda. Thanks so much. And I think it's so important and fascinating, the opportunities that people had to give it a try, to arrive from Martinique and to say, I have my freedom, to arrive and say I'm a soldier because I was on a boat with soldiers. I think that part of the work that we need to do now is to navigate, to find these cases and to bring them forward and to try to build some sort of a corpus. And this is sort of another part of the methodological diatribe that I didn't talk about, which is about how we build our corpus in order to talk about this kind of work, knowing that, as you said in your own paper, we're sort of managing scraps of paper and tiny one-off mentions. And as Saidiya Hartman has said, we see someone's existence only in the moment of their disappearance. And so, I think that I take that as a challenge, and that we absolutely need to pursue, and that I'm continuing to pursue right now. I agree with you on bringing nuanced perspectives to notions of discipline on a plantation and in the military. The reality is, and I wanted to show you all just a summary chart that I have of the different types of military punishments during the 18th century, which are pretty gruesome and are getting a little better over time. And of course, as we try to, navigate the archive about those punishments, how often were they meted out? How did they actually occur on the ground? We have very little information, but we do know that commanding officers, that, there are punishments that have to go to the civil side of the law. And then there are punishments that can remain within the martial realm. And those are the ones that could have been the most severe and that are often never meted out. And so, there's an interesting set of circumstances where, there's lots of awful things to say about what's happening in the military at this time, but there's also an opportunity there in terms of how military law is rolling out. And then, I'm very skeptical about the plantation stuff. It's true that we don't have any texts talking about people being crucified, and one in the 18th century in a French plantation, and one hopes that means that it wasn't happening. Later in the 19th century, if we are to believe Frederick Douglass, and of course we do not have our Equiano, we do not have our Frederick Douglass in the French Empire, and other eyewitness accounts of what's happening in the plantations. But what they say time and again, and I've sort of been spending a lot of time with Frederick Douglass, is the fact that what is out there in the slave codes and in civil laws, it has nothing to do with the plantation complex as a system and as a locality. The way that any particular slaver and set of overseers deal with corporal punishment and summarily killing people. There is a lot that either is permitted by the law, right? So in cases of certain, unless a certain level, if a certain level of resistance occurs, then you can just kill them. So there's stuff in different codes, North Carolina, Maryland. You can read about how these laws, created loopholes, but also there's just a lot of stuff that doesn't go on paper and that happens. And that is the sort of the invisible walls of a particular plantation as a space of discipline and biopower. So, I bring a lot of skepticism to, the claims of even wanting to preserve those bodies for labor. Certainly that was the case, and it's the case in the military as well. I mean, there really are a lot of connections there. But yeah, I let's just keep looking. I will definitely take your critique and be thinking about the subtleties of this, and I look forward to exchanging on that with you. But I also think we need to keep doing what we can to figure out, if ever, what was actually going on in those places. These people love to talk about their humanity and sensibility, and sometimes they should be taken seriously, and sometimes they're hiding something far more sinister.
Fabienne, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm joining you from Oregon. Hi, Christy.
Hi, Fabienne.
I love your presentation. Could you tell us a little more about the Maréchal de Saxe?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who was that man, and exactly what was going on there? And where are those archives where maybe one has either correspondence or other military papers? I'm just really curious about this Maréchal.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Fabienne. Steve and Miranda and other people at AUP have already heard me complain at length about, about working on this topic and navigating the situation of the archive on this topic. The Maréchal Maurice de Saxe came and served in the French army, obviously from Saxony, and had a sort of meteoric rise in that context. And he was very much a sort of darling of Louis XV. And so he was given the permission to do things that most people weren't, including creating this, this unit of volontaires. André Corvisier and some others have looked at this a bit and have been trying to understand what the story is. But it seems that part of his motivation in looking at his correspondence is that he was interested in learning about Islam. And so he wanted, and so his own suppositions about Blackness and who constituted a Black soldier, because as I said, there were people from the Indian subcontinent, there were people from different places who were not by our standards Black, but were counted as such to him, and he called them nègres. So, there's a sort of scary, objectifying, and spectacular part of this, where he sort of paraded them in military drills in Paris. There's one particular one that I talk about in my project, and they're sort of outfitted very regally, and they're on white horses. And so, I think there's a sort of a desire to co-opt and to associate with himself this sort of a notion of Black male power, which is really one of the things that I'm interrogating in my book. So it's an oddity, and Corvisier has said he was unintentionally revolutionary. I think that he was, on the one hand, revolutionary in an intentional way, but also in a light, in a sort of légèrement, in the sense that he wasn't trying to change the world by this regiment, but he did want to provoke the French public, and he did say in all of the papers, these men must be treated the same. There can be, they must have everything that the other soldiers have, and this is not, they must not be degraded behind closed doors. So I'm following what happened there in his correspondence. There are some records in the contrôle de troupes at the Archives de Guerre at the Château de Vincennes. But the longer story of these individuals, it's another one of those moments where nobody bothered to ask, what's the story of their lives? How many generations had they been there? What are their familial ties? Where had they been serving, and for how long? So much more information has to be brought together to tell this from a Black Lives standpoint. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Christy.
Thanks, Christy. Michelle, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thank you so much for your paper. I was just wondering, as to bring a comparative framework to this.
Yes.
Ben Vinson has written so much about the Black militia in the Iberian context.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just wondering if, because this is the way that Black men, have this discourse of honor as,
yes.
and using it for citizenship. And so I know that you said in the first part of the paper that you see some of that, in the characters that you're studying. But I was also, in the Americas, the sort of getting back to Miranda's point, in the Americas, the military conditions were so bad that really, that was what they were able to sort of highlight, the poor provisions, the, sporadic nature of maybe, and then there's some, tension between the Black militia and fighting Marronage, right? So there's, right. But we have a really, really fulsome record, of these men's lives. And I was wondering if in the French context, do you have that? Do you get a sense of the ways that they could manipulate this discourse of honor and citizenship? I was just curious. So, you know, both Ben and Hendrik Cray also write about this. So it would be a great conversation to talk about, you know, sort of masculinity and,
yes.
you know, that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I love that. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I really enjoyed your paper and the discussion in the last session. So I'll take this opportunity to tell you that. So yes, so a few people have been looking at this specifically in Saint-Domingue, to some extent in Guadeloupe. So some of the people I mentioned before, Stuart King, John Garrigus, more recently, and Frédéric Réjean. What's sort of interesting is that in those colonial frameworks, indeed, conditions are really bad. And most of the time when these men are being recruited, it's because other people are dead. It's because, you know, often, and certainly in the 7 Years' War, troops are sent over from the metropole to participate, and they die. They just, they die of disease, they die of the voyage. And so they're mostly decimated by disease upon arrival. And so, you know, this is often when these discussions of recruiting men of color, whether they're racially mixed, gens de couleur, or enslaved, this starts to be discussed. Otherwise, the system of the militias and the maréchaussée has a sort of other being. And, you know, Stuart King and John Garrigus sort of presented contrasting views on that, where Stuart King was talking about this militia class of men of color in Saint-Domingue, who sort of held positions of prominence in the community, and where this type of service was a part of a discourse of honor and respectability. And then John Garrigus kind of came back and tells another story where we see over time that these men, that white men do not want to serve with black men, that the officers of these militia units are still usually white colonial men, and that, you know, the battles for even being able to be patriotic in this sense really increase through the time of the 7 Years' War, and then after that. So there's interesting discussion in that regard. And then also the maréchaussée, which is the constable force that is in charge of chasing runaway slaves and tracking them down. This is where a lot of people end up serving. And interestingly, you know, serving in the colonial militia doesn't have the same level of credibility in the metropole. And this kind of goes to Miranda's point, that it doesn't hold the same weight. And certainly serving in the maréchaussée, this is all the discourse on, you know, men of color doing that job. It's not something that's going to allow them to afterwards say, you know, I'm a patriot, look at how I served the French nation. They are getting no political capital out of that service, at least from the sources that I've seen and what other historians have written. So, you know, I think part of the work here, and what I'm hoping to be able to do, is to contrast, and it's sort of where the thing you're putting your finger on, Michelle, these different types of service, and the different modalities of power, and the different types of leverage that they can sort of offer to a man of color in these contexts. So I think we need a kind of taxonomy, which, knowing that each of them is evolving and there will always be particularities, but I think we need a clearer understanding of how each of these pieces work.
Thank you. I have one random thing to say before I do my own thing, which is that I've been learning, and maybe this is useful for other people who are listening, so I'll just say this. I've been learning more about how in war circumstances, going to the archives of other countries can actually provide you more information on people that you're looking for than the National Archive of the space that you think you're working on. And this is connected to an observation. So I see a lot of people who claim that they've been imprisoned in England. and that they're sent from Martinique to England, and then they escape or are released from England, and then they go back to France. I'm talking about men of color in the 7 Years' War. My hunch is that because, especially if these guys are like capturing the drummer, is, you know,
yeah.
I mean, it's a little troubling because it's a little bit like capturing the flag, and it makes me think that something odd is going on there. But in any case, still, it's an archival question.
Yes.
The British have tons of files on prisoners of war.
Yes.
I think that you're going to hit the jackpot once we can go there.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I love that. And I totally agree. And I also thank you for that. And I also want to kind of second Michelle's comment about connecting across different empires when we talk about these things. And even, you know, when we approach the work that we're doing and I said this on Saturday at the event honoring David Smith and H. France, that if you take a snapshot of any part of the French Empire during this period, the number of languages that are spoken means that our sort of the way that we have evolved in learning through national tradition and our language skills being sort of restricted to, you know, only speaking French and English and German or whatever it is, or to doing Portuguese and Spanish and English, that we're not able to tell the full story. We actually need each other. And I think that moving forward, what we need to do to tell these histories, and we need to create space for this in the academy in terms of the ways that we valorize different types of scholarly production. We need to co-author things. We need to we need to come together and stop following this sort of the mantras of national history, which have also allowed the Black lives, the history of policing and brutality of Black lives to remain in the corners of national history, when in fact it is a global history, right? But we don't talk about it that way because we're not engaging in that way. So I think that moving forward is also going to involve a lot more collaboration, a lot more co-authoring. And I think actually it's going to be a joy to do that. So building on you smart people and your ideas.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to do me now. Is that okay? Yeah, great.
Please.
I changed my title a little bit because I focused much more on child giving in the paper that I circulated, but so you'll notice that theme, but it is a freestanding talk. So if you haven't read the piece, makes no difference really for this. Okay, I have a slide presentation. My competence with this is unknown. Let me see. Okay, so I think I can screen share, right? That's a thing. There's a button for that. Okay. Okay. All right. And then, how do I do this? Okay, I'm starting now. At midnight on 16 May 1754, 2 Paris police agents ransacked rented rooms near the Saint-Germain Abbey in search of teenage slaves, Victor Balthazar and Antoine Lafleur, and their little sheet is here, which I'll talk about in a minute, who were fugitives newly arrived to the city. The merchants in Nantes who owned them had sent descriptions of the boys to the Paris police. Balthazar, 5'4", broad-shouldered with slender calves, was last seen wearing a curly wig and a 3-cornered hat. Lafleur, 5 foot tall, newly recovered from smallpox, could be recognized by his diminutive size and disfigurement. Discovering Lafleur and Balthazar in the Rue de Taranne at the home of a master carpenter, the police sent them to the dungeon of Fort-l'Évêque. Soon, a Parisian banking house would approach the police as local representatives of the Nantes slave owners. The bank, called Widow de Brière and Son, paid for the boys' roundup and arranged for their transfer back to Nantes. The story of these slaves and of others like them, fugitives hunted by the Paris police, rattles commonplaces about 18th century Paris. In 1716 and again in 1738, the Parliament of Paris declined to register royal decrees that sought to limit the movement of slaves to French soil. That refusal has led 18th century Paris to seem an oasis of liberty, and even a place marked by precocious abolitionism on the part of the city's judiciary. Beginning in the 18th century, the Paris Court of Admiralty awarded freedom papers to the slaves of masters who resided or sojourned in the capital. After the mid-century, the court began to justify those awards of freedom by citing a legal maxim of supposed antiquity: there are no slaves in France. Alongside the apparent liberality of the city's judiciary, historians have nonetheless noted the multiplication of racist royal decrees during the last quarter of the 18th century that targeted both slaves and free people of color. These would include a 1777 act prohibiting noirs of any status from entering the realm, an act of the same year requiring brown people in Paris, enslaved or free, to register with the police, and a 1778 ban on mixed marriages. So my current project began with the chance discovery of several files describing the arrest of slaves in Paris, like this story, on the request of slave masters. The number of slaves for whom I have police files describing their arrest has since grown from a few, in the beginning maybe I had 5, to include about 50 people in what is a notoriously incomplete collection of documents. And just to underscore how incomplete it is, the document collection that I have the stuff about Lafleur and Balthazar from is called the Archives of the Bastille. And their archives essentially stop being reliable after 1770. And that's probably because there was systematic archive destruction by someone who was storing them to get rid of the stuff that was closer to 1789. That's what I suppose. But in any case, so if you want to find out more about slaves who are arrested by this manner, you have to come up with other strategies. And this is an example of I just want to insist that the practice of roundup of slaves seeking freedom continued well past the period where I can produce files, and I find evidence for this in other archives. In this case, I found, this is called a lettre de cachet, and it's for a very young girl who's 15, named Juliette, identified in the document here as a négresse, identified in her own testimony before the Paris Admiralty as an Indian girl from Bengal. So we can talk about interesting ways in which these racial languages vary, but I find that the same person appears under multiple rubrics. In any case, I just wanted to nod to the fact that there really is a continuation of this practice, despite the fact that the archive that I first began working with kind of peters out. So the way that I have begun to, I managed to increase my file collection was by checking the lists of all of the people who sued for freedom before the Paris Admiralty Court and seeing if they showed up in the Bastille files. And what did I find? I found that of the 46 files for people of color that I have in manhunts in the archives of the Bastille, 20 of them were slaves who either had just entered a legal proceeding against a master or had already been judged free by the court, and were then abducted by special kinds of warrants using the discretionary power of the king to quash those rulings. And the end of that story is generally that the person is either restored to his master's hand if that person lives in the port, or sent overseas to be, in many cases, or in general, I think, resold. In the case of Juliette, this is even worse because the girl entered slavery in India, sold multiple times, eventually ending up in the hands of a sort of place-seeking Frenchman. And then instead of being sent back to India, Bengal not being part of the French Empire, she's sent to Sandamak. So she's just sold into slavery. Okay, so I just want to insist that my archive indicates that slaves were considered a legitimate form of property in Paris, and that masters living in Paris regularly solicited and obtained the king's orders to kidnap and make disappear the slaves who claimed freedom. The police records are only my point of departure in this project, but I do think that we can see that already the police archives challenge certain commonplaces about the old regime. Notably, the free soil doctrine doesn't look very solid. Also, it's a received idea that colonial law is not valid in the metropolis, especially not in Paris. That seems questionable. I don't ever find evidence that slaves are punished or allowed to be punished according to the methods specified by colonial statute, but there is a view that property in one place is property in another. The regime, after all, the king is the author, is the person who promulgated the slave code that indicates the status of slaves. So the view of the king, or the king is also a sort of a misleading term here, because the word Louis that we see on this document is actually stamped, okay? So identifying things with the king would be a mistake, but the crown is committed to the idea that colonial law identifies one kind of property, and property indicated or legitimated by the king's law in one place should be valid in another. And that is accepted by the judiciary in Paris as well. And I also, another key point about my project is to challenge the notion of Paris's specificity with respect to the rest of the kingdom, in the sense that this notion that Paris is an oasis of liberty seems very doubtful. And so as I began to read through these materials and think through the ways in which they challenge these commonplaces, I committed to the idea of writing the history of Paris as an imperial capital. And I'll talk about what I mean by that, but I do want to gesture to a few things that are structurally important to the story. And these are changes to the character of the French state in the 18th century that caused a change between the relationship between the metropole and colony. The first is an event, we were just alluding to it in our conversation with Christy. What we know from the 20th century, and here I'm thinking about the Algerian War, sometimes imperial defeat and not imperial success is the transformative event for bringing imperial structures and people into the metropole. The 7 Years' War is an utter catastrophe for France. It ends with, well, they're driven out of India, they're driven out of Canada, they lose Martinique. Correspondence between philosophers are saying things like, everyone is laughing at us, we just lost Martinique. They get it back, but they lose a tremendous amount. The Indies Company is made bankrupt by this war. They lose their trading posts in Senegal. And the consequence of this is that a gigantic number of imperial officials, often accompanied by slaves, head back to France. So in addition, for example, when the British conquered the Senegalese trading posts, they send all of the guys who work for the French on ships out of the place, because they don't consider them loyal to England. So there are shiploads full of African men arriving in French ports as a consequence of this. So there is a tremendous reshuffling in terms of the relationship between France, domestic France, and the empire, simply through a contingent event, the event of the 7 Years' War, which brings all kinds of colonial practices that hadn't really been especially present in Paris into circulation. And here I'm talking about Paris because actually, while sure, these men go through ports like Bordeaux and Nantes, but the place hunting officers and members of the people who are officers of the Indies Company, that has its headquarters in Paris. So all of those people end up there. And anyone who wants to find a future job heads to Paris as well. So basically that's the kind of cluster where you find a large number of administrators accompanied by domestic slaves who begin doing things like freeing people by notarial document, who begin doing and who begin to sort of enable, I think, a growing notion of slaves as a legitimate form of property in France. They also emancipate people. That's also part of the story. Okay, but that's just an event. There's a couple of structural things that I think are really part of the story that helps to make sense of the idea of Paris as an imperial capital. One of the big stories is not about defeat, but success. And to illustrate, oops, right. So there's an imperial defeat in 1763, but actually the last quarter of the 18th century is not about losing power. It's about this shocking development of the French slave trade at a velocity that is astonishing, and the development of the plantation complex, especially in the colony of Saint-Domingue. So if we want to think about the relationship between Paris and the empire, right, there's the story about the meltdown of 1763, but then there's this really bizarre growth. And I've just captured a few years at the end of the old regime to show just how astonishing and quick this is. Really, the paper that I circulated unfolds at the apex, right, of the French slave trade, although the irony is, of course, if you look at these numbers, that 1790, right, after the French Revolution has started, is the all-time high for the French slave trade. And it's something that I think we really needs to inscribe in our understanding of what the revolution is and how, and just why no one is willing to debate slavery at the very beginning of the revolution. Okay, a final condition of possibility for thinking of Paris as an imperial city is what I call, and other people call, but I call imperial consolidation. This is where institutions start to be knitted together that are metropolitan and imperial. There are a couple of examples of this that I can allude to quickly. One is a new network of admiralty courts that is throughout the realm and also in the colonies, right? So there's a new kind of jurisdiction that works specifically to deal with imperial issues, but which has courts that are disseminated throughout France as well, and in the empire. And then another example, which is probably the best example, is the 1776 creation of the Imperial Archive at Versailles. So it's really no longer possible at that point to imagine that you have status as a slave over here, but in France you have a different status because there's a document, right, at Versailles describing someone selling you. Right, and those documents are really have also another interesting significance that I didn't talk about in the paper I circulated, but which I've become very interested in. Although, as Christy says, sometimes these, well, archive things are tricky when you're working on this topic. But what I will say is that I think that the French process of taking out loans often involves what we call an hypothèque. Right, you take out loans by basically using the collateral of your property. So I have found documents from the 1780s, not a huge number, but you know, again, when you decide to look for something, you start to find them, where people are hypotheking their property in Saint-Domingue in Paris to raise loans in like Genoa. So I think that the creation of the Imperial Archive enables new credit networks to take shape, because after all, there's a central place where you can see where that property is, where that property is documented. Okay, so that's something else. I don't want to go into that, but I do think that there is a really important way in which the archive plus the new courts help to create this new kind of knitting together of metropole and colony at the end of the old regime. Another expression of this imperial consolidation, it seems to me, is the multiplication of these racist laws in the late 1770s. And my view is that the more France and the empire seem to be coming together, the more essential it becomes to police racial categories. And historians have noticed that these racial laws are ineffectively applied, right? Everyone notices, even in my paper, I allude to this, right? There are children coming, there are people slaves keep coming into France. Black people keep coming into France. It doesn't actually work to prevent their entry despite this ban. And equally, it's a little bit more difficult, but people can still get married because there's priests have an autonomy from the government, which allows them a discretion over who they're willing to marry. Okay, so we could say that, okay, well, who cares about this late 18th century legislation since it doesn't seem to be very effective? I actually think that it's very important. And I think it's important for a reason that we really haven't explored. The most important reason is that these racial laws will enable, for example, instead of using a lettre de cachet, one of these warrants from the king to deport a wayward slave, for example, from Paris, you can now just go to the court because actually they're banned, right? So you can just get an act from a French court removing a slave or a Black or brown person from Paris. That's a tremendous change. So there's that. And and also what that means is that if you can deport a Black or brown person in the name of the new legislation on the noir, getting out of those kinds of forms of repression means you might resort to an argument like, I'm not Black, right? For example, these are kinds of things that American historians know about already, conversations about who is Black and who is not Black in court. But this is a very striking case. I have a quotation here, which is from what we call a factum. It's not what was actually spoken in court. We don't know that. I have little bits and pieces of what is spoken in court. But basically, in this case, a very light-skinned guy has a freedom trial in 1787 against his aunt, who owns him, okay? And she refuses to concede. And it ends up in the Parliament of Paris. And in this factum, his attorney, one of his attorneys, goes through a detailed description of his hair texture to explain, right, why he should not be subjected to the legislation on the Blacks, and hence should not, and hence this sort of removal order that was made against him should be invalid. So this is not, this is forcing a discursive racialization of the language of rights, oddly enough, during a phase that sometimes we refer to as the pre-revolution. Adding to that, Lafayette is part of the campaign in favor of this guy. So people, perhaps involuntarily, but because of the structure of law and the nature of legal discourse, are forced to adopt these kinds of racial languages of rights. Okay, so the larger ambition of the study, Imperial Paris, is a word that I've been using to mark an idea of the city as embedded in the empire. What I talk about in my paper and what I'm committed to doing in the book is articulating the existence of what I'm calling a transoceanic slave polity that has Paris as its center. And by this, I mean a kind of thing where you would imagine an entity that has Paris, but also the ports, but also imperial spaces, but also banking houses throughout Europe, and imagining that as a kind of a way of describing the evolving relationship to slavery at the end of the old regime. Because it's true that in other contexts, before Canada was lost, before India stopped being under French control, you could speak of empire and not actually be referring to the slave complex, but actually what happens in 1763, all of the things that don't involve slavery, probably with the exception of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, are gone. So the French Empire for after 1763 is a slave empire. Okay. And so while I want to avoid using the term microhistory, because I think that this term has now been leached of all meaning by overuse, I am trying through the stories of individual people to tap into this bigger history. And I'm hoping that by tapping into these individual stories and through them getting to this bigger history, I'll be able to sort of intervene, resituate the history of Paris three different levels of scale. Here I'm using a term that is used by Jacques Revel in his Jeu d'échelle. So the first level of scale is simply urban history, how we think about the history of the city. Second level of scale would be colonial history, because what I think is important in to understand many of these cases is simply to make sure that you're paying attention to what happened in the colony before the person came there. And finally, the whole story of the kind of empire as a bigger structure, because after all, the system of disappearance that I described, where a person is deported from Paris, winds up in a port, and then is deported overseas, and then sometimes either taken back to his owner or resold, describes an imperial network that is functioning with exceptional efficiency and suggests really it's part of the story of imperial consolidation. Okay, so the particular story that I tried to tell in my paper, and I've been thinking about, is the case of Eureka. This is not a picture of Eureka. This is the problem that I've been working on. Eureka was a young girl at the age of 2 or 3 who came to Paris with the governor of Senegal in 1786. She died in Paris in 1799. I'll show you a little scrap of paper that I have about what happened, a little notes about her property death. It's all I have about her in Paris. But what happens is that a person named the Duchesse de Duras, behind whom lurks a very wealthy plantation heiress who has married into a family that is much above her socially, writes a story in 1823 which appropriates elements of the biography of the original little girl. And this becomes this shocking success. There's a Eureka craze. There are copycat stories and plays. She, in the story, ends up in a nunnery, so that's why she's being represented this way on the title page. But one of my efforts in my paper and in my book is to try to work against what's been happening with the criticism on the story of Eureka, because there's been an explosion of interest of literary scholars in the story, but in the process, the girl has disappeared. And so I've been trying to bring her back bring her back into history, and through her explore a network of high-ranking nobles and very powerful figures, including the Minister of War, if we want to tie it back to Christy's story, right? And their involvement through the man who brought this young girl over to Paris in slaving enterprises. Okay, I just wanted to, this is a picture that was that's attributed to Sophie de Toth, and it's probably from 1793. It represents a girl who's supposed to be 7 years old. She's supposed to be 7 years old. Yeah, I think so. The bust is a funerary bust, I think, because that's her protector, who is the Maréchal de Beauvau. Just to a point of reference, the Maréchal de Beauvau's house is now the Ministry of the Interior. So if we want to tie it back to the story of the police, that is the building that she lived in, is the building that oversees all forms of police in France. Okay, I am troubled. I don't have time to focus on the articulate how I am troubled by the way this young girl is represented here, but I just want to show you that while she looks beautiful, there are some problems with the way she's represented that become a little bit more evident if you move between these pictures, this being a representation of a person in slave collar dressed for court. Slave collars were not, they were considered fashionable and gestures to Herculaneum, for example, and popular in the English world. But in any case, this is clearly a problematic image, and it's made more so by the nudity, which is a classic sign of slave status, which is, I mean, I don't want to, we can talk about that later. Good work has been done to show that is so. And so this is this apparently naive and lovely sketch painting, but in fact, I think is riddled with problems that were embedded into the story of Eureka and her question of status in France. at the time that of her arrival and even afterward. Okay. Now, she's not the only child who arrived with the Chevalier de Boufflers. This is the sketch or the little drawing and math problems done by another child who was 5 when he came to France and was given as a gift to the Queen from Boufflers. Because the Queen's property was appropriated during the Revolution, you will find his file. Not only, there are a couple files about him, but one of the most significant ones is in the archive of what we call the biens nationaux, which is to say, national property. He's adopted by the administration of the city of Versailles. He's their adopted son to enable his support after the after the Queen's property stops existing, and also so that they can. I think they are trying to help him. But in any case, the fact that he becomes a bien national for me is a sign that there was something odd about his status in France. Okay. And this is simply a picture of her legacy, her story about her property at death. I just want to talk about how I see this chapter as fitting into my larger project. It's completely different narratively, or at least it seems to be, but I'm a big fan of I think it's called heuristic or usefulness. The usefulness of using exceptional cases to articulate things that wouldn't otherwise be accessible. And I thought there would be a defect in my book if I kept repeating things using the same structure with the same archive, notably the same problem that I had with the archive that I was critiquing. Namely, if you stay within a particular frame, you're going to keep reproducing the same kind of story. And so it seemed important to bring the story of Africa into the narrative, mostly because, because while her story might be exceptional with respect to my particular book, the story of a little girl who loses her family and is led into captivity in Africa is consonant with the story of hundreds of thousands of other little children. And so regarding hers as the exceptional case in my book would be absurd, right? And so it's to underscore the absurdity of that I would like to include her in my book. So her case is distinct from the other cases that I considered a number of really important ways, but I think that they're all revealing and helpful for reading the other cases. One of the most obvious of which is that her vector of mobility is different. When everyone else is being carried out, she's being carried in, literally. She's a little girl, she's 2 or 3, right? I don't know who took her from the ship. I have to figure it out by it's hard for me now to get to these places to check the ship log, but I do think I can. And I do think I will have more of a sense than I do now of who might have been around her to take her into Paris. In any case, her vector of mobility is different. But what's also striking is her age is so odd, right? Because if there are quite a lot of children in domestic service who are slaves in Paris, they are not 3. They are between the age of 8 and say 15. And then you see this sort of very familiar pattern that happens of adolescent revolt, where people start to realize, they become aware of what it means to be a slave at a certain point. And so the flights that I see are really happening at the moment, where people are no longer children and they realize that what's happening. In any case, what I've noticed is that the high aristocracy starts to commit to a process of bringing in very, very small children, because their whole world is based on the principle that ludic excess is what their class stands for and utility is not, right? So it's important to have people around whose function is nothing, right? That's part of this is not everyday nobility. But the people that I'm talking about run the state, right? They're not we can talk about them as a small class, but all of these people are ministers, right? Or no ministers or ambassadors. And this category of person believes in the necessity of these, of having representations of excess and wealth. And sometimes this takes the form of baby jesters. And I talk about this in my paper. and two of the children who are brought over by Boufflers wind up in households where their job is to hug people or to act clownish. That's not the story of Eureka. This is a gendered story. She has a different function. And at basically what I argue in my paper, and I'm not going to reconstruct that argument because it's a little bit complicated and textual, but the argument that I make in my paper is that that Boufflers understands her as a precious object who is a sort of a totem object in the sense that he can imprint himself on her, and he understands her as a kind of love letter. So that's the argument of the paper, that he's her. The paper ends with a sentence like he sends her to his uncle, the Maréchal de Beauveau, as his love letter to an abolitionist, because the irony is that the person that he ends up sending, the girl who he insists is an object to, is in fact against slavery. Okay, but there's a couple of legal, since I do work on, I just want to signal a really glaring legal difference between this story and the stories that I tell elsewhere in the book, namely that all of the other folks who get abducted have these, it all hinges on these special warrants that quash judicial rulings. These are manifestations of exceptional, it's not exceptional because it's royal, but royal prerogative. You could think of them as legal enforcement tools because they're enforcing colonial property, but they certainly have they are discretionary uses of power and not legal normality in the sense of what the courts do. They're not judicial normality. On the other hand, the manner by which a person like Eureka entered captivity in Africa is sanctioned by international law, because in Senegambia, all of the relationships that France had to different local sovereigns or emirs were negotiated, written down, involved in reciprocal rights and responsibilities, and are now classified as treaties in the foreign ministry. So, so the curiosity here is that the abduction of people from Paris passed by way of the lettres de cachet, these unusual edicts, whereas the whole practice of the slave trade functions with the sanction of international law. And I want to insist on that simply because there is sometimes a perception, at least in France, that slave trading was this business that really nasty private companies were involved with, but that's not, but it wasn't the state. This is a very fundamental misunderstanding of how this worked. Okay. And finally, I just want to make sure that I leave time for discussion. So I think it's really productive juxtaposition, the story of this very young captive who comes to Paris, and the story of the people who are leaving Paris. And the reason I think it's important is that apart from my argument about the state and about Paris, I do think that the juxtaposition of these stories makes it possible to recognize and do justice to the centrality of sudden abduction, of falling outside everything all of a sudden in a moment, to Black experience in the 18th century and to the experience of enslaved people more generally. And so, so I guess I'm going to end there, but I do want to just a quick thing. Here I am going to go back to the Eureka and her legacy question. Okay, so this is the note that I found in the government unclaimed property archive. Well, it's actually not that. It's a combined archive that also includes seized property, because the government seizes the property of people who have no one to give their property to at death. And so those documents curiously end up in the same archive as things that were received from enemies of the revolution. Anyway, this document indicates that Eureka received a pension from the Maréchal de Beauveau and another pension that was given to her through another will. I suspect that it's the wife of Jacques Necker, who was very close to the Beauveau house and also was part of this pre-revolutionary abolitionist set among the high nobility, very small, but she's not in the high nobility, but Beauveau is, and has this sort of little group of abolitionists that he hangs out with. But mostly when I look at this document, what I'm really thinking about is how can I think about the legacy in a broader sense of Eureka, and so my ultimate handling of this story is to rewrite the relationship between the life of the young girl and the story of 1823. And what I'm planning, and I'm doing this, I can't share this, but I'm doing this genealogically. I have shown, well, I don't know if I can do this. I'm going to stop my share and then maybe I'll try. I have this crazy program that I have been working with, which allows you, this is so I've been making these family trees of the Carsan and Duras family. And let me see if I can do this. Okay, so basically what you can show is that if I click here, I go up to the Maréchal de Beauvau. This is the Philippe de Noailles over here. If I click here, his children go into the family that's the husband of the girl of the woman who wrote the story. Okay, so you can genealogically connect the two stories. And in terms of my larger story, for me, using vague terms like transatlantic or transoceanic slave polity has no meaning unless you can show this is a sort of actual practice, or there are networks that do this. And so what I'm hoping to be able to show ultimately is that, of course, they're not the same person, but the same set of networks generated both stories. And I can show that genealogically, and I can also show that using social historical documents, because while I love cultural history, I also feel like I'm not doing my work if I'm not also doing, granular social history. So I have the wills of everybody and stuff like that to connect these things. And I do want to say one thing about what happens to the transoceanic slave polity, which is that it blows up, kind of, right? Because of Saint-Domingue, all those people lose their property, except the author of this story, right? Except who has all of her property in Martinique. So all of the people that I've been talking about lose their shirts. And in the end, the Duc de Duras, who owned an island in Saint-Domingue, has to turn to the daughter of an admiral who is still loaded because France has just restored slavery. And so she gets her plantation money. Okay, I'm gonna stop there, but that's where my reflections have gone in terms of trying to rethink the connection between the story and the person. Thank you very much.
Well, do you want me to moderate for you?
Yeah, that would be so great. Could you do that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to moderate. So, so let's open this up for questions. Miranda, you've given us so much to think about, and it was nice. Thank you for pre-circulating the paper and then sort of giving us these other framing pieces of information here. There's a lot of good stuff on the table. Steve.
Yes, I mean, if other people are anxious to speak, I don't want to step in, but if there's sort of a space here to say a few things, I had sort of comments, questions on both of these fantastic papers, and like last week and the week before, it's really very stimulating and extraordinary to see how this is all coming together. So let me just say thank you to Miranda again for doing this and for her paper. And I guess, Christy, so there were, I'm trying to figure out how to say this, because I think it's fantastic to push beyond to my mind, you're obviously right that when we include these stories, we just have to think about these theories differently. I mean, that just seems so right, and the way you do it is very convincing. So I guess what I'm suggesting is a way to kind of, it's a little bit along the lines of Miranda's point about how it is to think about your response to Foucault, and how one might ask you to push this in a little bit further. And it's, to some extent, I mean, if we just step back, what Foucault is trying to argue, obviously, is that the emancipation story is not an emancipation story, at some level. And at some level, you're trying to say, well, it kind of is, okay? And so, but the obvious response to that is to say that, yes, but it is precisely by entering into this world that, in fact, they are going to be then subject to all these new forms of power. That is, that they haven't, therefore, somehow gone from one situation to emancipation or some version of potential possession, self-possession. It's that self-possession is precisely the relationship of power to oneself that then will start to operate on them once they are a part of a military organization or something along these lines. So I guess the question is, it seems to me that what Foucault is looking for is precisely the process of a depersonalization of regimes of power. And at that level, your story, which I'm very, very convinced by, but I just want to sort of push you to say something about how it is that this process of the depersonalization of power doesn't then act on individuals who integrate the military and therefore have this new opportunity of self-possession, when in fact the whole story of self-possession and the relationship to oneself is exactly what it seems to me Foucault is getting at. So just there. And Miranda, I guess I had one question about the sort of transatlantic slave polity, which is that's sort of related. It has sort of multiple parts, but one is the question of the degree of centralization in your story, right? So you've focused on Paris, which, I mean, the just the shock value alone is worth 10 books, much less the fact that we're on the edge of our seats waiting for yours. But beyond that, are you suggesting that the kind of centralization that we generally associate with the old regime monarchy is also essential to the functioning of this transatlantic slave polity? Or does Paris have a different role to play in that kind of a polity? So one which, I mean, I don't want to, overstate this, but something that might be a little bit more rhizomatic or something, but something that is slightly less centralized. And therefore, the reason when you look at Paris, to some extent, you're actually sidestepping a problem that Roved talks about quite a bit in the juridical, which is this tension between exceptionality and exemplarity. Because essentially Paris, it's not so much that Paris then is this absolutely exceptional case. It's that it happens to be a place where a lot of individuals come through and then bring their property, as you say, their slaves, because this is the place where the archives are kept, or because this is the place where the companies have their headquarters or are located. But in fact, what you're actually looking at is it's just an opportunity, because the archives are particularly good, to tell us a story about a series of networks that exist everywhere that aren't necessarily centered in Paris the way they might be otherwise. Or are you saying the centralization that exists in the old regime state is in many ways reproduced in this old regime transatlantic slave polity. And therefore, Paris is, if we understand what's going on in Paris, we can sort of crack the nut of the whole thing. So that's a sort of, I hope that's clear, but the idea is that there are these two sort of ways of thinking about the place of Paris. So those are my two questions, but thanks again for this fantastic papers.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm going to, in the interest of time, well, I thank you for your question. It's so great, and I appreciate that pushing. And I will connect with you on that later. But I want to ask Miranda to go ahead and respond to your question, so we can reserve some time for her here.
Thank you. So I think it's a great question. I think that when you call something a polity, it behooves you to sketch what you mean by polity. I can only describe what I mean. It's not shock value, frankly. Actually, the archives are not good. I just found lots of stuff. They're not good, really, at all. The issue here, and it's the same point that Paul Cheney makes in cul-de-sac, right, is that the nobility, which even earlier in the 18th century had been provincial, right, had been living on its estates, is going to Paris, right? There is this centralization of the nobility at the end of the old regime. They're all there. Now, 30 years before, you wouldn't have described the same person as Parisian. But the same people who had estates in some, even townhouses still that you can still see in their inventories, don't live there anymore. They live in Paris. Equally, people like the Fouache, gigantic slaving fortune in Nantes, they have hôtel particulier in Paris, right? So there is this new consumer society and also business culture and influence hunting, which means that if just empirically, you notice that people who aren't supposed to be in Paris, you identify with Nantes or other places, actually are there. Their wives are there, their daughters are there. That's where people are going. And so there is a reconfiguration. We're talking about a tiny class here, but where there clearly is a respatialization of the nobility, and they are all clustering in Paris, and the non-nobles, the wealthy bankers, are going there too. In terms of the level of centralization, I think it will work differently depending on what thing you're talking about, because there are political institutions, and then there are financial institutions, and then there are social networks. So I think it would be good for me to sort of separate that out so I can theorize them separately, or if not theorize them, just make them orderly. But in terms of financial institutions, I know from all of the studies, I mean, I could spend more time working on the earlier, there's some wonderful stuff that's been done on credit networks. And it's true that some of the provincial credit networks that were important in the earlier 18th century are still in place, but the head of those commercial networks has become a banker in Paris. So like an example of this would be, the Crozat family network was I think in Languedoc. It moves to Paris, right? So the kingpin of the network, as it were, is no longer in the region, but the regional credit network seem to still be in place. And so that's one of the things that I think, and we know this story about the little boys being returned to the Nantes slave owners by the banking family is instructive. So the ships are in Nantes and in Bordeaux, but that's not how you raise the capital for the kind of trips that we're talking about. Those are shockingly expensive and risky ventures. The insurance companies, the banking companies, the places where that you can raise the capital for the slave trade, that's not Nantes. Right, that's in Paris. And as Chaussino de Nogaret pointed out, it's they talk about hiding in plain sight. This is his whole argument, right? Which is that who else would be financing these gigantic enterprises? It's the nobility, right? So, so if the whole nobility is moving to Paris, as are the financial heads of the financial networks, and the heiresses of the colonial fortunes, and the place seekers, it feels to me that you have an overlapping center of many different things of interest that maybe that I have to work on my word polity and think about that, because that may connote a certain structure that is not reflected in what I'm describing. But there is a kind of clustering in a whole different set of ways that make it appropriate to speak about Paris as a center. So I guess stop there. I could natter on, but I recognize this quality in myself.
I find that very convincing, actually, Miranda, this sort of moment, this confluence of these people, of these sort of colonial officials and military officers, a different level of communication about these questions is naturally going to happen when all of these people are intermingling in a new way. So I find that structurally to be very, very convincing and interesting, and a novel contribution among others in what you have going here. So do we have other questions or comments for Miranda?
Well, do you have one?
Yes, I have tons of things too, because you've really got me thinking, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's really fantastic that you're sort of, working on these family histories, these genealogies. I think are so important. Of course, it made me want to see those for underrepresented people, for people like Eureka, which we'll never have. But I thinking about the roles of these individuals, I think it's really important and interesting the way that you're trying to characterize what these children, these gifted children, what do they mean? How do they function in this very high level of aristocracy? And two things sort of came to mind. And I know this isn't maybe necessarily the most important thrust of what you're doing, but certainly in this chapter, as I'm thinking about it, first of all, and then also thinking about the Maréchal de Saxe, I thought of that film, La France est un empire, France is an empire, that 20th century film, sort of showcasing French, the peoples in different places, that were a part of the French Empire, and sort of, trumpeting French dominance over these different places in the world. And so, I wonder if there's that sort of, if these people had been serving abroad in different capacities, if this is also a way of consolidating that, in many ways, failed political clout, right? Because the empire, so much of it dissipates at the time after the 7 Years' War. And so they're all coming back. But this is sort of continues to be a symbol both of France as an empire and also of their own role in that, in having these people around and giving them to other people, that it's a new way of them channeling that power. So that was one thing that I thought about. And then I also thought about the ways, and some literary theorists have critiqued this in the literatures, that, reading about the enslaved and reading Candide, or writing, being an abolitionist in the way of the armchair critic, is a way to sort of feel good about, being in the right place with regard to the crimes of slavery, and at the same time not do anything about it. I wonder if the presence of these little children, kissing these nobles, and the physical contact, the joy, the play, is a way to, and then caring for them, helping for them, people like Eureka, is a way to sort of continue to be an armchair liberal, to be able to, and I know this is a total anachronistic frame, but just to say that there's a way that the morally righteous stance can allow them to either continue their engagements in slavery abroad, or to perform, a sort of humanité, and then just not engage with issues of slavery. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, there are a lot of things there. The final thing is interesting. Certainly this question of what, because I suspect, for example, I didn't go into this in my written paper, but Eleanor de Sabran, who's the lover of Flay and with whom he writes all the time, there are a couple letters where he starts to refer to things as your company of Senegal, suggests that the woman has invested, right, in the, who's the recipient of this boy. So one of the arguments that I make in a previous chapter is that there are discursive rules about being a nobleman, which make it impossible to have serious conversations. Okay. we could talk about why that is, but it's actually true. And so that there are discursive rules of the salon in general. Now, the Maréchal de Beauvau with his like 3 friends, including Jacques Necker, is an exception. I'm not really sure what they say. Also, it could be a form of abolitionism that we would recognize as being a little limited, maybe compared to what we, but anyway, the rules of the salon world in terms of what's considered a normal conversation would not admit of the kind of sincere discussion of that we see in the English context, often inspired by religious people. And so to the degree that so what I find is looking at the ways in which you can't, like, here's another way we're not going to talk about slavery. We're going to be hugging, and then we're going to be having these interesting verbal rules. So there's a whole art of this. I mean, before they got to the National Assembly creating subcommittees so that they wouldn't have to talk about slavery, there was this whole other thing that was going on. And in terms of I think that this stuff at the 1780s were these very little children. I mean, in the paper, I make it clear that, first of all, I think it's really linked to the fact that the French are back in Africa. I mean, they've been in Africa, but the administrators are in Africa, and they're receiving, again, these exchange of gifts that are the center of French foreign policy in Africa to secure river access, stuff like that, slave captive deliveries, involve exchanges of gifts. The gifts, for sure, sometimes come in the form of slaves. So, including slaves that are 3, right? So there is some of that. There's the fact that no one wants to buy 3-year-old slaves. There are these orphans who are not possible to put on a slave ship, right? Who have no purpose, and that they have, I think, for Boufflers anyway, they have the pathos of beautiful things that are believed to be worthless by the world. That is the pathos of the child who's 3. The path is the beautiful thing that is deemed worthless by the world, a world that he regards as vulgar. So he's not an abolitionist. He believes that these are beautiful objects, beautiful things, but that's how he relates to them. And I think that I probably have to work a little bit more on the whole kind of world of the man of feeling, probably, in working through some of the things that you're evoking. Anyway, Judith, would you like to ask a question? We have almost no time, but I'm sorry.
Yes, Judith. Hi. So thanks to you both, and I'll try to be really quick.
No.
So I guess sort of thinking your 2 presentations together, Christy, I noticed that you didn't bring up sovereignty, right? You talked about discipline, but not sovereign power, which, I mean, clearly is the kind of shadow and other side of the disciplinary power that obviously is, Foucault then goes on to elaborate it, is never, kind of fully superseded, but it exists alongside and in dynamic relation to the disciplinary. And I guess then thinking with Miranda, your paper, I mean, there's a way in which I think there's a kind of interesting dialogue between the 2 on, kind of precisely these grounds, to the extent that on some level, what you trace over the course of the book, it seems to me, is on some level like the relationship between race, law, and slavery as part of, you could say, a restricted economy and a general economy. Right, so that in fact, what you're describing in the Eureka, that is the general economy, right, in which it's not, subject to, in a sense, the restricted economy of, you could say in a sense, the plantation, right, which is the machine, but is the kind of economy of luxury and gift giving, which of course is at the same time connected to the history of everything that the plantation is producing. So just sort of thinking about, luxury and, economy in relationship to discipline and sovereignty. I don't know if that kind of makes sense of how I'm kind of drawing the parallels between both of your presentations and the way in which I think on some level, you're calling attention to the fact that any linear narrative of supersession, a movement from one to the other, in fact, is belied and, in fact, completely scrambled precisely when you write the history of transatlantic slavery it back into the equation. Other small point, I think that, I love the idea of working with the genealogy. And it seems to me that you could potentially do a lot with, thinking about, race and blood and nobility and genealogy, right? And so what is the work of the gift giving of the useless slave child in the affirmation of a certain embodied conception of the of noble lineage. And here, just one other thought that that also came to me is your description. Was it who was the Baudel? Actually reminded me in certain ways of Emmanuel Sada's account of how the racialization in the 1930 law in Indochina is around the whiteness.
Yeah.
Right. And so in fact, part of what you're describing there is that the articulation of race actually comes with making a claim to whiteness and belonging through whiteness. So that was just a kind of whole mess of things, but that's what kind of occurred to me and listening, reading, and I think there's just great stuff about age, and I'm doing all sorts of stuff on childhood, so thinking about the age component and how thinking with age as a category of analysis in relationship to gender and race. It seems to me is really crucial, in part in relationship to the kind of thinking about the dynamics of sentimentalization that you're talking about, right? Because the figure of the child is so central to that, and so central, as we know, to the genealogy of abolitionism.
Yeah. Well, there are so many great things. Christy, you want to go first? I feel like, hey, let's keep going. I don't feel like.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead, Miranda. Thank you so much, Judith. That's fantastic and very helpful. No, Miranda, please go ahead.
Oh,
I think
okay.
I occupied the floor for a long time, and I'm just
gonna. There's a lot of rich stuff that we could talk about together. So I just want to the flash of yes first comes in the form of embodiment of race in relation to the nobility and this story, because as we know, right, the Minister of War, Ségur, who's married to a plantation heiress, who in my paper sends a personal slave convoy to Senegal to collect slaves for his plantation using a warship, is also the person who creates the Ségur law, which racializes the military. So I actually think that this is an area that, I'm trying to resist, what's that thing in Middlemarch, the key to all mythology is like,
oh yeah.
Right. Avoid writing the key to all mythologies, but I hope that I can work that's important story in, and I'm so terrified that I'm writing the key to all mythologies. But anyway, I think that the Ségur race connection is really just leaps out, and the relationship between sovereignty and luxury is such a brilliant observation, and it just, for me, a lot of things. I don't have a clear answer, but I really do think that it's a brilliant insight. And it's something that I haven't really worked in, because as it's connected to Steve's point, actually, because I've been using this word polity, but I haven't really set it up like a polity. So thinking about questions of sovereignty is sort of missing, right? Even though I've been talking about power, rating all over the place, but there hasn't been a structural way in which I've ordered this. And I think the luxury is clearly one of the ways in which power is exercised, and that's what gift is about. But I think that ultimately, I probably have to go back to the gift literature to work out how to connect political power, sovereignty, and say interesting things about it in relationship to these really different cultures of luxury, because there is a really specific culture of luxury. And, you know, in terms of Christy's paper, I just done this culture of luxury, and I've been talking to these 17th century people, and it turns out that like the fact that we thought there was a classical age, that's completely wrong. And actually the whole thing was Baroque. so this might actually be productive in terms of this story about luxury. If we pretend that that's just bogus and stuff that we got about that in school was all a mythology of the French state, and reconceptualize the whole period as actually Baroque, some of these things might have interesting answers that we would conceptualize differently. So that's just some random thoughts.
One suggestion that I have is Charlie Coleman's new book on the spirit of French capitalism, okay. Which looks at, he's like shifting from political theology to economic theology and foregrounding the religious significance of gift-giving luxury fetishism. I mean, it's all like woven in the way in which like a kind of this, what he describes as a Catholic ethic, is all about the an imagination of the economy, not just in terms of investment and saving and productivity, but also about consumption and luxury. So that's, one place to look. And there, it's in his account of the law. Yeah, the law affair stuff.
Thanks, that's super. Yeah, I've been thinking about the fact that the nobles obviously are constantly pushing against the idea of the object as a commodified object, and they keep kind of create. So there is this really, the argument I make in the paper is that the construction of Eureka is as the non-commodity.
Right, which I think but that's what's great about it, is that I think you're actually putting your finger on the fetishization of race in like the kind of literal sense of the fetish, and able to trace how that can actually be transferred to abolitionism. Right. Like, I think that's what I was saying in terms of the focus on and all of the kind of creepy, aspects of abolitionist sentimentalization, right, which we know preserve aspects of racial fetishism, even if they try to kind of reverse the balances. And then I just have like one question I had for Christy too, and then I know like we all have to go. I have to prepare for class. If you're engaging in any way with Vince Brown's stuff on thinking about the kind of history of slavery in relationship to the history of war. And I think that there, I'm sorry I missed the very beginning of your presentation, but I think that may be a kind of way of kind of thinking with the French state, but also against it, in terms of going back to Steve's initial question about the kind of meanings attached to war and warfare and militarism that are not necessarily entirely contained within the logic of the state. In terms of if you're kind of interested in thinking about the self-possession and the resistive aspects as well.
Thank you, Judith. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So I think I have to now reassume my position as the head of this symposium series, and I just want to thank everyone for being such generous attendees, and I just am really excited about our next event. So next Monday, we just heard from Judith a little bit, where we'll be talking with Josh Cole and Judith Serkis about their new books, or recent books, I guess. Judith's book is Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, but her talk will be based on the book, but not entirely about the book. And Josh Cole will be talking about his book, Lethal Provocation, the Constantine Murders and the Politics of French Algeria, which is about pogroms, a pogrom in the city of Constantine, which is incidentally the home city of the French Algerian Jewish historian, Benjamin Staha. So it's sort of an interesting, for me,
I mean, I mean, just to say, like, my talk is mostly based on the book, but I'm just drawing out the ideas. I'm drawing out like one aspect that
I'm glad it is based on.
Okay. Okay. But I just, kind of wanted to speak to the specific concerns of the seminar.
Well, I think everyone's super excited. I'm going to make sure there's portions of the book that are available that we'll send out once people register, so that we'll be able to have a taste of what that is. And we look forward very much to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks to both of you for great presentations, and I love the paper, Miranda. So looking forward to more discussion.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye. See you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.